my name's Maureen McCall. I've been a Red Deerian for a long time, and I was very fortunate to be able to take a trip to the Galapagos in 12 days in February and March of this year. So I was just saying to some of my buddies who've come along kindly to support me that not all the photos, just to be for the sake of clarity, not all the photos that you'll see, this one is the one I did take, but not all the photos in the presentation are mine. I was having problems importing some of the great photos that some of my fellow travelers took with their much fancier cameras, but between using Google and Apple and different computers and storage issues, I couldn't use all the best pictures. So some of them are stock photos free on the internet, just to illustrate some of the points that I wanted to share with you. So who else has been to the Galapagos here? I know that at least, yeah, three other folks have been to the Galapagos already. So why would you want to go to the Galapagos in the first place? I'll explain a little bit more about exactly where this place is in a minute, but what draws people to take a trip to this national park in the Galapagos Islands is that it is an active holiday, if that's what you enjoy. On our trip, we were snorkeling once almost every day and often twice a day. You can hike on volcanoes and walk on beaches, kayak, paddleboard, go swimming. So you are active almost all day long. I slept so well every night, I have to tell you. If you enjoy a learning holiday, and those are the kind of trips that I really love. We learned something new every day about flora, fauna, geology, history, and you meet fascinating people when you go on a group tour like this, because it's people who are also interested in the natural world. And so you always have something to talk about over supper and breakfast. You're visiting a national park, and I'm a big supporter of national parks and preserving our wild spaces and trying to help protect our native wildlife. This national park has got very strict rules about what you can and cannot do, and you must be with a guide at all times. And so you learn a lot, but you know that you're also making as little damage to the ecosystem as possible as well. There are wild things there that you will see no place else in the world, which is always fascinating. If you love photography, and especially nature photography, it is a paradise for people who have those interests. There is abundant sea life. There are two big ocean currents that meet in the Galapagos Islands, one that comes from the north that goes along the coast of Costa Rica, one that comes up the coast of South America, and the warm water and the cold water meet together there. It brings lots of nutrients into the water, and that's part of why things thrive there most of the time, although El Nino years and the changing climate and the warming world is starting to affect here as well. There's good weather really pretty much all year round. It's right on the equator, so there isn't a winter or a summer. It's a little rainier or a little less rainy, but that's about it. And there are a variety of tours to suit pretty much everybody's interests and abilities. You can go to the Galapagos on a land-based tour where you stay on the one island that has places to stay, hotels, bed and breakfast, things like that, and go daily in boats to go to visit islands and see things. You can also go on a boat tour. You can do tours where you visit some really interesting places on mainland Ecuador first. And there are big cruise ships like Carnival and companies like that you could do all the things you'd like to do on a big cruise ship, and there's little ones like the one I went on with no entertainment, no casino, no shopping, just the way I like it. So. Oh, I just wanted to mention also the national park was born in 1959, my birth year. So that was kind of fun to visit a place that was as old as me. So where in the world is the Galapagos? Here's South America. And Ecuador is in the upper half of South America on the west coast. You can see it's one of the smaller countries in South America. And the little Galapagos Islands in red there are 930 kilometers away from the mainland. So you were really out in the ocean in the middle of nowhere. It turns out that the Galapagos are almost the same distance from the southernmost part of Costa Rica as they are to Ecuador. The Galapagos Islands were discovered in 1535, and discovered is the right word because there were never any indigenous peoples there. And that's when the Bishop of Panama, imagine the bravery, get on a ship in 1535 and decide you're going to sail from Panama to Peru, because it's part of your job as the bishop. And his ship was becalmed and they drifted into the Galapagos Islands. So that's when it was first discovered. He called them the Insulae de los Galapagos, which in Old Spanish meant the islands of the tortoises. And sailors also called them Las Islas Encantadas, the bewitched islands, because the really strong and shifting currents made navigation very difficult there, and ships were quite often getting into trouble around there. This archipelago, so here's a close-up of some of the islands. There's a few other little tiny ones up here and a few other further down. Is 13 larger islands, 6 smaller islands, over 40 islets. The name Ecuador, as you might have already figured out, is Spanish for equator. So the equator runs right through Ecuador and through the Galapagos Islands. The islands are similar to Hawaii in a way that they are the tops of volcanic mountains that rise up from the bottom of the sea, and they're sitting on a tectonic plate that is constantly moving towards the mainland of South America and diving underneath that plate. And so islands that are closer to the mainland, the most easterly islands, disappear and new islands pop up as their volcanoes continue to erupt and the plates shift. So I learned last time I was in Hawaii that there are some islands there that are relatively new and others that have totally little islands that have disappeared in the same way as here. This is one of the most active volcanic areas in the world, similar to Iceland and Hawaii. And there was actually a large eruption on Fernandina Island while we were on our tour. Unfortunately, it happened the day after we visited Fernandina Island, so we couldn't actually see the eruption, but ships that were coming after us had amazing pictures, and on the internet were amazing pictures. And it's an uninhabited island with humans anyway, so there wasn't any major safety issues. I found out about the tour that I went on thanks to a posting on a social media page that had to do with a school that I went to many years ago. And it turns out that a fellow who was 2 years behind me at the school went on to study forest ecology. And then his name is Marc Patry from Ottawa area. He and his wife ended up moving to the Galapagos, and in the early 2000s, he led a multi-million-dollar project to try, and he was successful, to rid one of the islands, Isabella Island, from 150,000 feral goats. So Back in the 1500s, sailors that came through, of course, you had to bring your own food on the boat, right? They would let the goats off onto the island to graze and feed, and then a couple of the goats would run away, and they couldn't round them up when they took off again. So from those first few goats that got left behind, 150,000 appeared. They were out-competing so many of the endemic species because, of course, they were eating, goats eat everything, right? And they were eating the native plants, the cacti, and so Mark led this project. His wife, Heather, had also studied forestry and forest ecology, but she had a more artistic side. She ended up working for the Charles Darwin Research Foundation, helping them improve and develop their interpretive signage in English and in Spanish, and developing educational programs for school kids and visitors. Those early career experiences led to them going on to work for UNESCO for a number of years, where they had the adventure of going around the world investigating possible new UNESCO World Heritage natural sites. And when they had finished that adventure, they had helped so many of their friends go to the Galapagos for visits because they knew everybody there. They knew all the tour operators. They knew all the boat owners. They knew where all the wildlife and everything was. Then they realized after they'd arranged for about the 10th trip for their friends, we could do this for a living. So they started CNH Tours. Their company now has branched out besides Galapagos Tours, and I would argue that they're probably the expert in the Galapagos of all the different companies. But there are big companies like G Adventure Tours. Some of you may have heard of them. They're a big Canadian company, and National Geographic, of course, Smithsonian. They all have natural tours that they lead there. But I would argue that the people that become my friends and my colleagues from school days are probably the experts in the Galapagos. They have small boat tours, and they have tours for people who want to like snorkel 5 times a day and get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and live on crackers and cheese. And then they have nicer tours for people that want to relax a little more. But they've branched out now to the Okavango Delta and Kalahari Desert in southern Africa. That tour is led by someone who's kind of the Jane Goodall of that area, who's a really naturalist and conservationist. Madagascar and Antarctica. Most tours to the Galapagos start on the mainland in Ecuador. You have to fly to Ecuador, of course. The capital city is Quito, and there's lots of interesting things to see and do in and around Quito. They have got a highland area in Ecuador, which have an ecological ecosystem called cloud forest, where you get these low-hanging clouds, very, very moist. They have amazing bird life there. There are quite a few. There's a hummingbird, at least one hummingbird sanctuary there. So bird watchers, it's kind of a bird watcher's paradise, especially on the mainland. They have this very rare, relatively rare bird called a quetzal, which many birders want to check off on their list as having seen it. Ecuador is the world's #1 exporter of roses. So you can visit flower farms. They've got lots of volcanoes on the mainland as well. You can hike, visit volcanoes. There is a viewpoint, the Mirador de los Volcanes, on the edge of Quito. And if you go up there on a clear day, you get a view over the valley and see the volcanoes in the background. And they have a giant swing that swings out from the top, and you swing out over nothing, over this abyss. I didn't do it, but other people did and enjoyed it. About 7% of Ecuador's population are indigenous, and you might have heard the biggest tribal group are called the Quechua, and Quechua are the descendants from the Incas, and they have a unique language, culture. And there are more and more indigenous-led tour companies. They also have a very small part of the Amazonian rainforest in Ecuador. So you can fly inland and then take a boat up the Amazon and stay deep in the jungle in the Amazon. Many of those companies are led by indigenous groups as well. Unfortunately, Ecuador has become a place that Canada now has on the exercise a high degree of caution list. So violent crime has become much more common. There have been kidnappings, assaults, sexual assaults in broad daylight, in tourist areas. And just before we were about to go on our trip, about a month before, Ecuador issued a state of emergency because their relatively new government had decided that they were tired of gang activity in Ecuador. Ecuador isn't really a producer of illegal drugs like opium, heroin, etc. But Colombia is a big producer of that. So is Peru, and those drugs were being distributed and moved out of South America through Ecuador. And so there were big gang groups, and Ecuador decided to crack down on the gangs. Some of the leaders of the gangs were basically in country club type prisons and were running their empires from the prison, so nothing really changed. And so they cracked down. They moved some of the worst guys into a higher security prison with less option to continue their business. And there were riots in the prisons, prison breakouts. Some of the gang members went to a national TV station. Imagine having gang members, suddenly show up on TV while Ian Hannah-Mansing is reading the CBC News, and they killed 2 TV anchors in prime time on the TV. So of course that made everybody going on this trip very, very nervous. Our Mark was able to tell us, look, we're landing in Quito, we're taking you from the airport to a hotel that we know in a residential part of town. We will be going to see just a few touristy places, and you'll see lots of armed police and army there guarding government buildings, etc. And then we get on the plane and go to Galapagos, and Galapagos is average risk as far as the Canadian government's concerned. So he reassured us, and we felt comfortable to go in the end, and I never felt the least bit at risk. But I feel like it's important to tell anybody who's thinking about a trip to watch carefully for that. It turns out that Ecuador also is one of the world's best producers of chocolate, and genetic evaluation has shown that the oldest cocoa tree in the world was found in Ecuador. So Ecuador is probably where cocoa first started and was exported from there. We went to a chocolate producer, and you learn about how they harvest it, produce it. We got to try all different varieties and concoctions of chocolate, which was nice. The boat that our friends arranged for us to go on, we were just 32 people on this trip. And it turns out that Mark and his wife decided that they were going to organize this trip, and they advertised it on our college, connections webpage as a fundraiser for our school. So all the profit that they would make from it, instead they were going to give to the school. So we were just 32 people from US, Canada, Bahamas, Malaysia, Australia, France, and England, I believe. So it was a really interesting bunch of people to chat with. The boat that we were on, called the Evolution, won Travel and Leisure's award for like 5 years in a row as the best intimate ocean cruise line. There was a nice hot tub at the front. You can see all around the front of the bow is laundry line to dry out your wetsuits and your bathing suits and your laundry and things like that. And we would desalinate after snorkeling for a while. You could come and sit in the hot tub and get the salt off as well. Beautiful food, for the most part, locally sourced from the mainland and from seafood from fishermen and from. They have a little bit of farming on the biggest island where there are year-round inhabitants. I'm not going to go through the itinerary of what we did every day, but just to give you guys an idea, these little letters in blue beside here, S stands for snorkel, P stands for panga. Panga was the local word for like a zodiac boat. So a panga ride, you might be, sitting all along the sides of the Zodiac and going in and out of little coves and looking at the birds up on the ledges and things like that. W is walking on the islands, PB is paddleboarding, K is kayaking. So we would go from island to island, usually cruising overnight and anchoring during the day. Our boat was quite small, so we could get relatively close to the islands. We didn't have to have a long ride in from the boat into the islands. And the national park very strictly controls how many people per day go on each island, and each cruise company that is taking a tour around will have, like months ahead, have to get their approval of their itinerary and how many people are going to be on the island, and so they work it out that way. So everybody's itinerary is a little bit different, just to make sure that they keep those numbers down. So the little dotted lines on here is like a typical itinerary, and ours was quite similar to this. We landed at where's Baltra? There's a little island off here called Baltra Island, and that's where the main airport is, the international airport. It was a U.S. Armed Forces base during World War II, and they set up there to make sure they could protect the Panama Canal and patrol the waters there. They were there for not for very many years, but they built a good airstrip, and that became the tourism airport. The airport itself was really quite interesting. Everything in the airport is run on sustainable energy, except for the jet fuel, of course. But they use solar, wind, the heat from the volcanoes. And when you walk from the plane into the terminal, you walk through a lava field that's fenced in as a garden, and it's full of lava lizards and birds, and you start to feel like you're in a zoo when you're in the airport. And then you get on your boat from there and visit all the different islands. Different islands and different areas have got maybe more numbers of certain species, specific birds. So by visiting all these different places, you got a chance to see a good variety of what the islands have to offer. The very first day, these are a few pictures from the very first day on the trip, we went from the airport across Baltra Island, got in a little panga, and then went to a mangrove swamp where they had a hammerhead shark and manta ray nursery. And the water was crystal clear, and you could see all these little baby sharks swimming all around us. And then we went into a cave area. You can see how clear the water is. This is one of my photographs. So even with my crummy phone camera, it came out. You can just see how clear the water is. Sun protection is super, super important on a trip like this. You're right at the equator. You could get a pretty bad sunburn even in about 15 minutes. You can see on either end of this slide are some of our guides and the boatmen. So this is their job, most every day of the year. So they all wear long sleeves, long pants, hat, sunglasses. They wear either a bandana or a veil across their face to keep the sun off their faces, gloves to keep the sun off their hands. And you can see we had our special UV protection shirts and big hats on. I went through 2 big tubes of reef-safe sunscreen because you'd put it on to go snorkeling, you'd put it on when you were sitting out eating your lunch, you put it on again to go for a walk, and so we were having to be really careful. Unfortunately, my good friend here, Shauna, on the very first day we were snorkeling, she had just fins on, and she didn't have leggings. And she had put sunscreen on every place, but hadn't reached right at above, the back of her ankles and behind her knees. And she got a sunburn the first day. So, that kind of really wrecks your trip. So if you decide to do a trip like this, sun protection is a must. So the next slides, I'm just going to give you an idea of some of the fascinating animals and wildlife that you can see there. The marine iguana. First thing I thought when I met these guys was, aha, I see where they got the image of Godzilla. I mean, doesn't this guy look like Godzilla with the big... Anyway, these marine iguanas they can grow to be about 3 feet long. I think they can weigh up to about 10, 15 kilos. And most of them are black, but there are some that come in hues of pink and green. They look kind of like, I call them the Christmas iguanas. What's really amazing is these miserable-looking creatures that you would think might be venomous or dangerous. They live on nibbling little bits of one specific kind of algae that grows in the rocks in the tidal areas at the coast. How thousands and thousands of these guys can live on salad, I don't know. I gather they can eat, the occasional bug and a few other things if they're really hungry. But in El Nino years and with the bleaching of the rocks and the warming of the water, sometimes the algae doesn't grow as well. And then they have huge die-offs of these lizards. They're cold-blooded like all reptiles. So they tend to sunbathe a lot in the day to get warmed up, and at night they do pylons. You see these, as the sun is going down, if we were going for an evening walk, you'd see them all lumbering up and climbing on top of each other, and the pile was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, just to try and keep each other warm. So if you said to your friends, I was swimming with penguins in February, the image that come to their mind might be, okay, you must have been in a dry suit in Antarctica and somebody dipped you in for 5 minutes and you came out. But if you said, no, I was in my bathing suit, nobody would believe you. The Galapagos penguin is not well known, but it is the northernmost penguin. It's a warm water penguin. These guys are not very big. They're, I don't know, maybe a foot and a half high when they're fully grown. I only saw like maybe 5 of them during the trip. There's 2,000. Apparently, they think the population estimated a couple of years ago was around 2,000 left in the Galapagos Islands, because there was a huge die-off again with a very hot year and decreased food for them and the wrong temperature for the eggs to hatch, etc. But it's really fabulous when they dive in from a rock and shoot past you to go and snap up a fish. And they are really, really fast swimmers. The sea lions, I think, were probably my favorite creature that we interacted with in the islands. Again, you can't touch, or you're supposed to stay, 6 or 10 feet away from the animals, and the guides are very clear about that. But that's our ship in this is our ship in the background. There's our punga that we came to this little beach by. And there we are swimming in the water with the seals frolicking on the beach. So they're really, the thing about the Galapagos, because they have very few predators, and apart from back in the 15 and 1600s when sailors were catching tortoises for the meat, they're really not afraid of human beings. So that's why you can get such great pictures and get so close to them. They are very playful when we were snorkeling. They would come up and come this far away and then shoot around, twirling and swimming around you. I would swear they were laughing and playing with us, and it was really, really delightful. There's one of my buddies with some people had GoPro underwater cameras, so they could get some really amazing shots. The picture that's on the poster for today's talk is actually my screensaver on my watch. One of the people on our trip had the software to be able to put together a whole bunch of different pictures of sea lion and created a circle of sea lions. So the sharks, that took a little getting used to, I have to tell you. I've been lucky to be able to snorkel and years ago scuba dive in some places with beautiful coral reefs in the South Pacific, in the Caribbean, and I think I'd seen maybe 5 sharks in all the 20 years of snorkeling. You might see a little reef tip shark way down there you see kind of a shadow of, and it takes off. We saw sharks every day on our snorkels, oftentimes 10, 15 sharks in an hour and a half in the water, and we'd see usually 2 or 3 different kinds of sharks. It started to get to me, knowing that we were in a big group. We had a guide with us, and the sharks feed early in the morning, and at sunset our guide said, "Look, you're not their food. They're full. They're just swimming around to get the water to flow over their gills to keep the oxygen flowing. They're not going to bother you at all." It got to be a little bit like hiking in Waterton, where you see a lot of bears, right? But you can say, "Oh, there's a bear." Well, we're all together and we're just going to walk away. So it came like that. Black tip and white tip reef sharks were probably the most common that we saw. Oh, we see the occasional hammerhead shark, and they're so cool to see. The Galapagos shark is kind of a tawny colored shark, and it's a relative of the tiger shark. And the 2 people on our trip who were from Australia had a very clear concern about being in the water with tiger sharks, because in Australia they've attacked lots of human beings, but we never had any trouble with them. There is one area where divers go, especially with a high chance of seeing whale sharks, which are the biggest sharks in the world that look like a small whale, and they're actually polka dotted. And I don't have a picture of that. I didn't see one, but that would be really interesting to see. You've heard of a gaggle of geese, a murder of crows, a pod of dolphins. Do you know what you call a group of sharks? Yeah, that's good. They're actually called a shiver. Isn't that great? A shiver of sharks. When our boat would be sailing at night, of course they had lights on for navigation and also lights to be able to see rocks and things like that in the water, and the lights would attract fish. The fish would attract the sharks. And so there were a couple nights where groups of us would just sit out on the deck at the back and watch dozens of these tawny Galapagos sharks just swimming all around and circling the boat. And that gave me the shivers, I'll tell you. So probably the most famous birds in Galapagos are the finches, and called Darwin's finches. And I know we have at least one very keen birder here in our midst today. The thing that makes Darwin's finches so famous is that and it wasn't actually Darwin who discovered this. He was a collector, really avid collector, and unfortunately, to collect things, he had to kill them. But he had dozens of birds that he collected on each island that the beagle stopped at in the Galapagos. And he carefully cataloged them, that this one came from North Fernandina Island, this one came from South Isabella Island. And he brought all these dozens of birds back to the British Museum. There was a very famous naturalist named John Gould who looked at all of his finches and realized that they were different species of the same finch group, and that each island was a little bit different. And that the differences had to do with the shape of their beaks, as you can see here, the size of their bodies, the shape of their tails, and each adaptation had to do with what that island offered for them to eat. So some Darwin's finches eat insects, some eat seeds, some remove ticks from tortoises, some eat leaves, some eat flowers. There's even one finch that sucks blood from seabirds. And there is a species of finch that uses twigs and cactus spines in its beak to extract insects from inside holes in trees and cacti and in bark. So each of these adaptations were things that they had to do to be able to survive on the island where they were living. So this plus seeing variations in mockingbirds were the two things that really twigged Charles Darwin to come up with the theory of evolution. There's a really wonderful PBS series, I think it's just called Evolution. And one of the episodes is about a couple, Peter and Rosemary Grant, that have been going to the same island. The name of the island was just on the tip of my tongue, but have gone back to the same island for over 20 years. And every year they go back and they catalog the birds that they see and photograph them. And what they've seen is when there's been a change in the environment, or big storms, or some animal has eaten up most of the usual food that the finches used to eat, and they had to change their food source. They've actually documented there have been major changes in the shape of the beak and the size of the birds within 2 breeding cycles. So Darwin thought it would take hundreds of years for all of these changes to happen, but they've shown, at least in the finches, and I think in that evolution program, they show different types of animals in different parts of the world and how they have adapted really quickly, and how species change has happened much more quickly than we thought it could. Now, for somebody who's a very amateur bird watcher, the finches held no interest for me because they're all little brown things up there. They don't have an interesting call. So unless you can have a photo lens and you're interested in the difference in the beak shape, they're really not that exciting. These guys are exciting to see. The blue-footed boobies. They have bright colored blue feet. And it apparently is some pigment that comes from one of the creatures that they eat that gets processed and made into this blue color. The healthier the male specimen, the brighter blue are the feet. So that's partly how they attract their girlfriends. And their mating dance has a lot to do with showing off the feet. And they also are used in a lot of naughty T-shirt pictures and little ornaments and things like that you can get on the when you come into the touristy port. But the name booby has nothing to do with the crazy things it talks about on those T-shirts, but comes from the Spanish word bobo for clown. because they are they're so interested, so curious. They've got these crazy dances that they do to attract their mates, and that's where Bobo got changed to booby. It's also where the term booby hatch comes from, the hatch that's on the front of sailboats, because these birds would often just rest on the bow of ships, and they would come to check out who was coming. There are a few varieties of boobies. There's red-footed boobies. There's a booby that's got a white face called a Nazca booby, and we saw all of those as well. The great frigate bird was we had 2 hours on one island that was just fabulous because it was a frigate bird nesting site. And the male frigate bird has got this big pouch that when it's not blown up just sort of hangs, and you can see a little bit of the red. But then when they inflate it, it's huge, and it's like half the size of their body. To attract a mate, they build a nest. So this second picture, the male is sitting on the nest, and this is one of the ladies checking him out. As one of our guides said, the males build the nest, and they sit on the nest, and they do their mating display. The females fly over, and if they look down and say, not very nice, it's kind of messy. IKEA furniture. Looks like he lives with in his mother's basement. Forget it. But their display, they inflate this pouch, they stretch out their wings, and then they do this shimmy, 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 and they have this vibrating song. It's really amazing to see. And so we got to watch that for like an hour. We even saw some actual mating, which our guide said is pretty rare. We just happened to be in the right place at the right time. The great frigate bird has got feathers that go from the nape of its neck down its back that are a greenish color. There's another frigate bird called the magnificent frigate bird. I thought these guys were magnificent enough, but magnificent ones are a little bit bigger, and they have a magenta sheen to those feathers. So we may have spotted one, but this island was mostly for great frigate birds. There were so many interesting birds to watch there. On the boat, we would see petrels flying over, and there was one that the locals called the Jesus bird because it looks like it's walking on the water as it takes off. Flamingos we saw on one island, lava herons, blue herons, lots of shorebirds. Most of these aren't endemic. They fly through the islands, and you might see them other places. Tropic birds I'd seen in Nepal before, but they are so unmistakable. They have this long ribbon tail that kind of floats like this as they fly through the air, so you can't miss them. On the left-hand side, you can see the red rings around the eyes of this gull and the red feet. That gull, the Galapagos gull, is the only nocturnal feeding gull in the world. I've seen a NOVA program about some of the birds in the Galapagos, and their feeding habits are still a mystery because they leave at sunset, go 15 to 30 kilometers out to the ocean. They know from looking at stomach contents of dead birds that they eat little squid and whatever, but how they find them in the dark and why they would fly so far to eat is, one of nature's mysteries. Oh, and one of the other things that our naturalist told us about was these birds that fly such a long way to find food. They sleep for like microseconds at a time. So they sleep while they're flying, they sleep while they're standing, and they never just go to sleep and stay asleep for hours. And so there's a lot of research going into this to say how can an animal actually survive and thrive when it's sleeping for its brain goes into sleep mode, like REM sleep, only for half a second at a time, many times a day. And those of us who've had some issues with sleep would love to know how you could do that. On the days when we were lucky enough to be able to go onto the islands, we'd have to go early in the morning or late evening because it would just be way too hot in the middle of the day. This island that I walked up to the top of a volcano, and you look out to, this is called Pinnacle Rock there. That's on Bartolome Island. You could see, if you're interested in volcanoes, you can see every kind of lava formation and tinder cones and tuff cones and all sorts of amazing geological things. If any of you have seen the movie Master and Commander with Russell Crowe, it was quite a few years ago, but about old naval battles, etc. It was actually filmed here. One of the few times that, rare times that the government of Ecuador allowed a film crew to come into that area and film there. I guess they got a lot of money to help with their conservation efforts. Then on land, you got to see, we were talking about, just as I started my talk, about the land iguanas. They're big guys, and they're very quiet, and they mostly nibble away on cacti. And you can see them with big cactus spines sticking out of there. Like, they've got the toughest mouths, and then they sort of rub their mouths on rocks and things like that to get the spines out. The feral goats were big competitors with these guys. So getting rid of the feral goats was important for their survival. The Galapagos tortoise is one of the most famous animals that you can see there. And these guys are huge. Like, they can grow to a few hundred pounds. I think the oldest one they've been able to document lived close to 200 years, and many of them live 100 years. There was a preserve where there was one, I think his name was Charlie. They'd given him some name like that. And we didn't actually visit that preserve, but I saw pictures where a young Prince Charles visited there. And then, a number of decades later, a young Prince William visited there and saw the same turtle. We watched the tortoises migrating along pathways on one of the islands. And they have an interesting project with school kids in Galapagos where they attach GPS signal devices onto the carapace of the turtles, and then the school kids actually map out where tortoise number 37 started and when they went and how long it took, and then when they went back, and they're learning a lot more about how these guys live. That tells you this woman is a little smaller than me, but can show you how big those guys are. The left-hand picture are actually photos of baby tortoises at the Charles Darwin Research Center. They raised them there to try and then repopulate islands where, again, they've been outcompeted or where there's been some disaster like a volcanic eruption that disrupted their food source. On one of the last days on our trip, we visited the Charles Darwin Research Center on Santa Cruz Island, where Mark and Heather had both worked for a number of years. This poster, or this mosaic, is actually like a portrait of Charles Darwin made up of many tiny little pictures of all the animals on Galapagos. This park naturalist is telling us about how they incubate the tortoise eggs, and they put them in a cupboard and turn on a hairdryer. And if it gets to a certain if it goes to a certain temperature, much more likely that the babies that are hatched will be males, and if it's another temperature, it'll be females. And they've just got a very simple little thermostat that turns on and off the hairdryers. So they use simple technology, but it works. We were very lucky because of the connection of our tour operators that we heard from the head of research from Charles Darwin Center, gave us some highlights of some of the over 50 ongoing projects that they have there. And my last slide, just I want to say if you're interested in a trip like this, these are a few things that I did bring with me and others that I wish I'd brought with me. So I'll share with you the tips. You definitely want to bring lots of sunscreen and lots of lip balm. Those little reef walker shoes would be great, or sandals for when you have to jump out of the boat and walk through the water and over the lava rocks to get up to go for a walk. Those neoprene scuba booties can make a difference between getting blisters from the flippers and getting a sunburn on your ankles. A little dry bag to carry your camera and other things you don't want to get wet when you're out in the punga boat. I learned that you can get lots of different ways. You get a little lanyard that'll attach onto your phone, so it'll hang around your neck, and you have your hands free for hanging onto the Zodiac so you don't fall out. Take at least 2 bathing suits, UV blocking shirt, or rash guard they call them if you wear them in the water. And I just took yoga pants to keep my legs from getting burned. There are these sun sleeves that you can get that you pull on, and they go underneath your t-shirt. And then as the sun goes down and it's getting cooler, you can take the sun sleeve off, and you don't have to be taking a whole shirt off. So those are pretty cool.